Today's video is brought to you by Card Kingdom. Head on over to cardkingdom.com to pre-order your Zendikar Rising cards today.
Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it is time for one of my favorite videos, every set release. It is top 10 Zendikar Rising cards for the Commander format, which means I'm joined today by Tomer. How's it going today, Tomer?
I'm doing well, Seth. This is also my favorite time of a set cycle when we talk about the sweet Commander cards.
Yeah, we always keep it to roughly a half hour. Get through the 10 cards, nice and easy. Everyone loves it. So, Tomer, before we get into the individual cards, what do you think about the Zendikar Rising set for Commander in general? I almost dropped this question. It's like a traditional question that I ask every set, but I feel like sets are designed with Commander so heavily in mind these days that like every set's a good Commander. It's not like 5 years ago when we're like, I mean, it's an okay set for Commander. It's got some stuff. It feels like every set these days just has like a ton of stuff specifically made for the Commander format. Would you agree that Zendikar Rising is another one of those sets?
I honestly think if you ask Wizards of the Coast straight up, like, are sets designed now primarily for Commander in mind, they would say yes. I don't think it's like a secret anymore that like every single set is a Commander set. It used to be like a meme like last year or whenever like Modern Horizons came out, people would be like, oh, it's actually Commander Horizons, you guys, ha ha ha. And it was kind of like a meme, right? Like people were like joking about it. But now, no, we're serious. Like every single set is actually a Commander set. Like, I remember they mentioned, like, offhand, like, over the past, like, year or 2 years, like, the amount of people joining up for Commander has tripled. And it's just, like, it is by far the largest constructed format. By far. Like, without a doubt. So, everything is geared to it now. Every single constructed set is a Commander set. And this is a reflection of it. Like, the list we have here is more than 10 cards. And it's just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so many good cards for Commander in this set. It's mind-boggling when you compare it to like the last couple of years, or like back in like Kaladesh, maybe like 3 years ago. So if you want to see a full review, I have a three-part set on all the cards I thought were really good in Commander and why. So if you want to read, use your eyeballs to read, then I have a three-parter. I go super in-depth. This is just the tip of this is a teaser to all the good cards that you'll see in the full set for Commander.
Yeah, definitely check out Tomer's review articles. They're really good. They'll be linked in the description if you're interested. They should all be live, I think, by the time this video goes up. But anyway, let's start talking cards, Tomer. We got to keep under a half hour, which means we should probably start talking about our top 10 Zendikar Rising cards for Commander. And number 10 on our list, we have, I guess I would say like multiple cycles of cards. Basically, we want to talk about the double-faced Modal Land cycle, essentially. The spell lands. So there's a ton of these in the set, ranging from mythics. There's a cycle of mythics down to rares and a bunch at lower rarity as well. Essentially, one side, as you can see with like Aghanim's Awakening, is a spell. The other side is a land. The mythic ones can come into play untapped as long as you pay 3 life. Otherwise, they come into play tapped. The lower rarity ones, from rare down to uncommon, always come into play tapped. They tap for 1 color of mana, so not dual lands. Tomer, what do you think about these cards in Commander? Like, how good are the cards we have here in specific? Aghanim's Awakening, Valakut's Awakening, and how good is just like this archetype of cards, these double-faced modal flip lands?
So, obviously, every single modal land, I'm just going to call it modal land for short, every single modal land has a lot of inherent power for the fact that it's flexible, right? Like, if you need a land drop, you can play it as a land drop. If you want it as a spell, then you can cast it as a spell. Both sides are going to be slightly unappealing. They'll have a couple drawbacks to them, but the power lies in that flexibility, and it's really hard to overstate how good that flexibility is. Like, just the fact that not missing a land when you have a modal card in your hand is really, really, really powerful. Make sure that you're not falling behind. And then to avoid land flood, you have a spell. The spell might cost 1 extra mana for its effect, but basically, instead of just having a land, playing a land and saying go, you actually have usually a desirable effect to cast instead. And that's really, really good, especially in the late game. We can't go over every single card, but there are some like general things I want to talk about the Modal Lands about really, really fast. So flexibility, obviously really, really important. If you are happy playing the card more often as a land, then take out a land for it. And the opposite is also true. If you're happy with playing the card more often as a spell, then take out a non-land card for it. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover really, really fast is the fact that a lot of people have been saying that there's absolutely no drawback to playing a modal face land, especially the mythic rarity ones, because they come into play untapped. And I feel like that's a little bit of an oversimplification. That might be true in like a few decks, but I think that most of these lands, even the ones that come into play untapped, the mythic rarity ones, they still have a cost for running. So for example, Agadeem's Awakening, you can play it as a land that enters the battlefield untapped and attacks for a black. And you can say, oh, it's just a swamp, but better. But not exactly, because you have to keep in mind that if you jam this card in a mono black deck, oftentimes mono black cards or mono black decks have a lot of inherent synergies, or a lot of staple cards have a lot of inherent synergies with just basic swamps. So you have Cabal Coffers, you have Cabal Stronghold, you have Crypt Ghast, you have probably like Gauntlet of Power. You have a bunch of cards that basically double your mana output of your swamps, and swamps only, or at least basic lands. And Agadeem, the Undercrypt, is not a swamp, so it doesn't work with those cards. So you are losing some synergy, some power by not running a swamp. There is a drawback to it. Is a drawback relevant in a 99 card singleton format? Maybe not so much. Is the the upside of having Agadeem's Awakening in your hand instead of just having a land worth it? I think most definitely. But there is, I think, a drawback to running them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm really high on these cards. I think these cards are super, super powerful, especially the Mythic cycle that can come into play on tap. But really, I think the Rare cycle is pretty strong in general as well. And some of the uncommons are good too, but that is a really good point. There is a cost, especially if you have synergies that revolve around basic lands. You got swamp synergies in black. You have like Emiria and basic plain synergies in white. So it's not a complete free roll, although I think it partly depends on whether you're counting them as lands or spells. Like, my feeling in Commander is that the best way to play these cards is not to aggressively cut lands for them. I feel like rather than aggressively cutting lands, maybe you can, like, if you're playing, let's say 4 of these in your deck, maybe you can cut a land and go down from like 37 to 36. But I think the most powerful way to play these cards in Commander is count them as spells, essentially, and have them be a way that you can actually have more lands in your deck. I think one thing a lot of, especially newer Commander players, tend to undervalue is just having as many lands in your deck as possible, because Commander is a very mana-intensive format. I think getting up to like 40 lands by playing some of these actually will improve your deck quite a bit, and you kind of get a little bit of that free roll aspect. So I feel like if you're counting them in your spell slot rather than your land slot, then a lot of those concerns about like not working with swamp synergies or not working with basic mountains or plain synergies, a lot of those concerns go out the window. And I feel like a lot of these effects are actually at least decent, especially the Mythic cycle. Like Seagate Restoration, the blue one, it's a reasonable card draw spell. Turn-Timber Symbiosis is a good way to find your creatures. And then some of the rare ones like Ondu Inversion is a slightly overcosted Planner Cleansing, but still it comes attached to a land. You have a removal spell and Hagra Mauling. So I feel like this cycle is actually really good, although I do think people will probably be disappointed if you're playing like a 3-color deck and you're just like, oh, I can cut 15 lands from my deck and play 15 of these flip lands. I think that's probably going to work out a lot worse than people expect. I will say I'm very concerned about these cards in non-commander constructed in 60 card formats. I feel like I don't know. I feel like it reduces variance too much. I think that's less of a concern in Commander, where you have 100 card singleton, so you already have a lot of variance built into a Commander deck just because of how the format works. Do you have any concern that these are auto includes Tomer? Like, is this another slot that is just always taken up? Assuming you're playing like 1 to 2 color decks. I think there's also a huge cost to these if you're playing 3, 4, 5 colors, just because you want pretty much all your lands to tap for at least 2 colors of mana, or be basic lands that you can find with your cultivates or other basic land tutor effects, fetch lands, etc. But in 1 to 2 color decks, do you think, especially the mythics and the rares, are these just auto includes that are going to show up a high percentage of the time, or do you think the downside that you mentioned is actually a reason for decks to avoid playing these cards?
Well, I definitely agree with your assessment that if you're counting these cards as non-land cards, which I think you should for the most part, then yeah, the concerns of them taking up a basic land or whatever, and your deck is full of basic land synergies. Not all decks are, especially like the budget decks are not, full of like extra planar lands and more expensive cards like that take advantage of basic land types. Then yeah, these cards are definitely. I don't see a reason why not to run them if there's no other like synergies or that promote running like a basic land instead of them, especially when you're not taking out a basic land for them. If you're just putting it in for a non-land slot, then I don't see a reason why not to run these cards. Some of them are like the white one, Amari's Call, I just don't care for, and like. Yeah, I guess it's great to have that as something in your back pocket that you could make for 2 angels for like 7 mana or something, and then your creatures, your other non-angel creatures, not even the angels themselves, are indestructible until your next turn. So if you have a buttload of mana, you could like play that card and then board wipe, which is very janky, and win Mori in my way, in my opinion. Or you're kind of safe for more board wipe until your next turn. I don't know. Like that type of card is like, would I really want to take out a non-land slot for that? Probably not. I mean, maybe in some decks that actually care about the tokens or the effects, but
or like
probably not.
Angel tribal, maybe.
Yeah.
Like if you have angel synergies. I think like I think that's a good point. Like the effect of that card is not that great. On the other hand, I think if we go to like the white rare double face modal flip card onto inversion, 8 mana, destroy all non-land permanents, tap land on the other side. I think if you're running like planar cleansing type effects or anything, I feel like in a format like Commander, this is very close to just strictly better. Like I think paying an extra mana or two, I think that downside is very much outweighed by the fact that you have a land you can play in the early game. Maybe you keep a land like hand and you need to hit your land drop. Like that offers a lot of flexibility that you wouldn't get from something like planar cleansing. I think the same is like sort of true of Hagra's Mauling, the like 4 mana destroy a creature effect. Yeah, that's not like traditionally like murder, or even bad murder arguably is not traditionally like a card that you play in Commander, but if it's coming attached to a land, I think then it suddenly is in the conversation in your removal slot because of that flexibility. So I think it does have to go a little bit on a card by card basis. I think I'm most high on the Mythic cycle where you can play them untapped if you need to, but I still think that I will be playing a ton of these cards, especially the Mythic and Rare cycle. Once you get down to the lower rarity ones, I think you need to be a little bit more selective. Some of them are just, I don't know, not very, like Spikefield Hazard, 1 damage to something. Like, is that something you care about? Or like Vastwood Fortification, put a +1/+1 counter on something. Like, is that something you actually care about in Commander? Like, I'm not even sure that being on a land makes that card good enough to put in my deck. But I think for the Rare and Mythic ones, I'm definitely pretty high on them and plan on playing them in a lot of the decks that are in their colors. I'm sure there's exceptions for specific decks, but I think a lot of like mono black decks or 2-color decks of mine will have Agadim's Awakening because it feels a little bit free rolly, and anything that can get a few more lands into your deck I think is a positive in Commander.
I totally agree with that. I think it's like if the card has a desirable effect on the front side of it, then you want to run it in your deck. And a lot, I went over basically every single modal land in the set, and most of them, especially like the uncommons, are good for basically one exact deck. There's one that makes like a rogue and is terrible in most decks, but for rogue tribal, it's actually pretty decent. especially because you could also play out of the land. And I went through every single one. And basically, every single one has a home that I would say is almost like a staple for it. The Mythic Rarity cycle, I could totally see an argument saying that, yes, if you're monocolor, if you're mono black, or even two color, you probably won't want to run this and you'll never really be punished for doing so. The rares, again, is more universal effect. My favorite is Valakut Awakening. It's like, I think of it as like a super cycle effect, or a super cycling effect. I would say for most of these cards, you have to say, like, for at least the ones that come into play tapped, a good comparison are basically just like the basic cycling lands. If you look at a card and it has an effect and you're like, okay, is this effect and being the option of playing as a tap land, is that effect better than just a tap land that says you can cycle it for 1 or 2 mana and draw a card? Is that effect better than just, drawing a card? Some of them I would say no for a lot of decks, unless that effect is highly desirable for that archetype. So I think that's actually like a good spot for these. I don't think they're super pushed in that way. The Mythic Rarity cycle probably are an exception. For the other ones though, I feel like they're comparable to cycling lands, and I think that's a really good spot to be in.
Well, let's move on and talk about the next card on our list.
30 minutes.
Number 9. I think we went 30 minutes just on the double phase Modal Lands. So off to a good start. Number 9 on our list. This is an easy one. Forsaken Monument obviously cares about colorless mana in specific, also colorless creatures, but I think the mana doubling is probably the biggest payoff for this deck. So I'm assuming, Tomer, this is a colorless commander card. If you're playing Eldrazi or like Traxos or Karn Silver Golem, things like that, is this just an ultra staple in any colorless commander deck?
Yeah, I wanted to point out Forsaken Monument because the colorless decks are a thing. They're very, very niche because, it's the most restrictive you can ever get in Commander in terms of like your options for a card pool. So this is really cool to see. This is like the best colorless card they've ever printed. It's like a super mana reflection for your deck. All of your mana sources now basically tap for an additional colorless mana, and that's really, really good. That is the main effect of this card, by the way. It's mostly for its mana. The other two effects are nice to have. They're nice bonuses, but the main effect is just adding a ludicrous amount of mana for it. So any colorless deck. My favorite is Kozilek the Great Distortion, but I also like Traxos, Scourge of Krug, or whatever it's called. All those colorless decks are going to love Forsaken Monument, and it's going to be a nice boost for all those colorless decks. I think it also can show up in a couple different decks that are super, super artifact colorless mana heavy. The one that immediately pops up to mind is the mono red artifacts archetype. These are usually led by a commander like the Ready Scrap Savant. These cards run a ton of mana rocks, and almost all these mana rocks are tapping for colorless mana, like Thran Dynamo, Mind Stone, all those stuff. And because they're artifacts, you get extra synergies with it in those type of decks. Forsaken Monument, I think, is actually a really solid inclusion in those decks as well. And it also has combo potential. So everybody's favorite, Basalt Monolith, now it taps for 4, and you can pay 3 to untap it. Boom, colorless mana. It doesn't make infinite mana with Grim Monolith, but... it doesn't make infinite mana with Grim Monolith, but it does make infinite taps and untaps, which could be relevant in some situations where you have like Mesmeric Orb or something like that. So there is combo potential with like some key cards that are always showing up in colorless and like artifact heavy like decks. So that's another bonus for this card. But yeah, this card is a staple in some decks that needed the help.
Tomer, so let's say you're playing that Mana Rock deck. You have Forsaken Monument. Does that make Hedron Archive into a good card in your deck?
No, absolutely not.
Even if it taps for 3 mana, still not good enough. And
I'm not going to play good cards to make bad cards decent, Seth. All right? I'm going to play good cards to make good cards even better.
Even gooder.
Yes, goodest. The goodest. No.
So So I gotta say, the thing I like about this card is, if you look at colorless commander decks, a lot of the most popular ones are built around Eldrazi. You mentioned Kozilek, but also like Emrakul is on there, the unbanned Emrakul, Ulamags. Most of them are really expensive. So, Forsaken Monument is an effect that those decks really, really want. I feel like if you're playing all these like 10/11/13 mana Eldrazi as your commander, slamming this on turn 5, or maybe earlier with the help of your mana rocks, if you just untap with it, you're already to your commander, which is incredibly powerful. Like, that's why the Eldrazi costs 10, 11, 13 mana, is because they're really insane effects. This, doubling up all your colorless mana, is going to get you to your commander much, much easier, and make it a lot easier to recast your commander if it does get dealt with. So I feel like it is just the stapliest of staples for colorless commander decks. I can't even really see an argument for not playing this with essentially any colorless commander. I do think some of the mana rock synergies are interesting. I hadn't really thought too much about playing it in a non-colorless deck, but I think you're right. If you have a lot of Hedron Archive type effects that are tapping for colorless mana, maybe this is in the conversation. The only thing I don't like about this card is I feel like the rest of the text on it is sort of just like throwaway text. Like, if you're playing Eldrazi, do you really need to give them +2/+2? I guess like incidental life gain is always nice. You're not going to complain about it. But I feel like really, like, the only reason you're playing this card is for it to be a mana doubler. But even as just a mana doubler, I think that's more than good enough for essentially every colorless deck, and maybe some other decks as well.
Yeah, I mean, there might be some situations where you have a colorless deck that has a bunch of, produces a bunch of artifact tokens or artifact creature tokens, like a bunch of 1/1 Thopters, for example. And then that Anthem effect is actually really powerful. But for the most part, they're just kind of like the cherry on top. And it's almost a little bit of a trap for some players, because some players will be like, oh, this is a powerful Anthem effect. I'm going to throw it in my Kadena effect, or in my Kadena Morph Tribal deck, because, they get +2/+2 when they're morphed, and whenever you cast a morph spell, you gain 2 life. Wow, that's really good. It's not that good. It's not that good for 5 mana, at least. It's pretty decent if it was cheaper. But if you're not getting full value out of the mana increasing effect, then I would not run it. So I would not run it in a Morph Tribal deck, is what I'm trying to say. But if your deck can actually get full value out of the mana, then go for it.
Let's move on to number 8 on our list. And we have a card that people have been asking for a while as a card that hates on opponents ramping. And I think people have mostly asked for this in Standard and in Historic, but Confounding Conundrum, I think it's pretty relevant for Commander as well, where you have tons, especially green decks, playing Cultivates and Kadama's Reaches and all these like effects that tutor extra lands on the battlefield. Once you get down Confounding Conundrum, you essentially just shut off all those cards for 2 mana, right, Tomer? Like, is that the main purpose for this card in Commander?
Yeah, it's pretty busted. The fact that it's asymmetrical hate too is highly relevant, because like most decks are going to be running, fetch lands and everything like that. You can run your fetch lands and run this card alongside it without any repercussion, while your opponent's fetch lands are suddenly very bad. And like, if you want to play Wooded Foothills and then crack Wooded Foothills on the same turn, you can't really do that. You have to like play Wooded Foothills and then wait like until another turn to actually crack it and get value out of it for your next turn. So you turn like the fast fetch lands into slow fetch lands, which is kind of hilarious. It also like completely shuts down the appeal of like green ramp spells, like rampant growth effects too. If you like play a land and then rampant growth, you suddenly put a land into your hand instead of onto the battlefield, which is really, really annoying for enemy green decks. So Confounding Conundrum, it's highly effective for what it does for just 2 mana, which is just like slow your opponent's fetch lands and just general green ramping effects without even negatively affecting yourself as well. And while I don't usually run a bunch of hate cards in my decks, the fact that this one draws you a card is what really, really puts it over the top, because even if you're not going to get any value out of its ability, you've still drawn a card, so at least you've basically cycled it for 2 mana. And I think that's super relevant.
Yeah, I think that card draw ability, the cantrip ability, is really what makes this a card that you can play in a lot of your blue decks, really. Like, you can slot this in pretty much anytime because at least you're going to cantrip. 2 mana to just cantrip is not super exciting, but it's never going to be a dead card, which is really powerful attached to what is already a good hate effect. So I think that's really powerful. My favorite part about this card is it's one of those cards that allows the budget player in a play group to compete with the less budget players. Like, this is a card that you can play in your budget deck and kind of punish the people who have a mana base full of fetch lands, for dual lands, and shock lands. So this is a way that can kind of like catch up the budget player with the people that are playing, a lot more expensive decks. So I think that's a really powerful aspect of the card. The other thing I really like about this card is the card draw ability also has some synergies. Like if you're Bragoing or you have Yari on, different blink effects, this card goes up even more in value because it's an enchantment that you can keep blinking to draw a card. Also could show up in some enchantment style decks, enchantress style decks, although blue is not like the most popular enchantress color, but still that offers a little bit of extra value as well. So how much do you think you'll play this card, Tomer? Like, is this good enough that you just slot it into every blue deck, or is it dependent on like your playgroup, what you're expecting to face as far as how many fetch lands, how many green ramp players? What do you think about that? Like, just how playable is it?
I think you nailed it. I was going to mention actually that it's like, I think it's an auto include in any blue enchantress deck. So Tuvasa the Sunlit is like a very popular enchantress option. So I think this is like a slam dunk because not only are you drawing a card off it, you're probably going to get additional card draw if you have like a Mesa Enchantress on the battlefield or something like that similarly, or any other enchantment matters synergies. So that it's going to be just an auto include there. And then, yeah, like you said, Brago, it's also going to get extra value whenever you're blinking your board. Outside of that, are you going to jam it into just any deck? Well, maybe. I think if you run Conundrum, worst case scenario, you're just going to be cycling it for 2 mana. Best case scenario, you're just completely slowing down your opposing your opponents. So I think the power floor of this is very high, and the power ceiling of this is very high for its mana cost. The only problem is that your opponents, if your opponents are slowed down by it, you will be targeted a lot for it until the Conundrum goes away. So there is like an offset, a balance on that too. You're getting this really powerful card, but it is a hate piece, and people don't like hate pieces, so they're going to target you more often than if you didn't have it on the battlefield. So that could actually work against you. And if your meta does include landfall decks, like Azusa Lost But Seeking, this might end up actually helping them, where they can actually intentionally bounce their lands back to their hands to trigger more landfall effects. I think that's a corner case scenario, and I think even those decks are going to be hurt more by Conundrum than it's going to help them. But there's something to keep in mind that it can sometimes actually help your opponents rather than hindering them. And also it is going to attract a lot of negative attention on your side of the battlefield.
Yeah, and unfortunately, if you're playing against a color that isn't especially good at removing enchantments, the game plan might just be removing you from the game. So there is some risk. Like, you don't want to anger so much of the table, shutting down like their ability to make mana, that everyone just like kills you because you played a random 2 mana enchantment. So, but really, I think it's powerful enough that I don't think I would avoid playing it because of that, but it is worth keeping in mind. Like, especially as you're playing a game of Commander, there might be times where you think twice about dropping this, depending on your position at the table. Maybe you don't just like always slam it on turn 2 in every game and kind of wait to see how the game develops. But regardless, really powerful catch-up card for budget decks against non-budget decks, and really good in enchantment decks for sure. Moving on to number 7 on our list, we got a nice little white removal spell, Skyclave Apparition, and this card looks a little bit like Banishing Priest, Deputy of Detention, but it has a pretty meaningful upside, I think, Tomer, in that it doesn't give back the permanent that it exiles when it dies. Instead, whoever's stuff you exiled gets a token of the same power and toughness as the converted mana cost of that permanent. How big of a deal is that in Commander, Tomer?
I think that's huge. Like, Banisher Priest and those effects, they're still playable in some decks in Commander, but the fact that you are giving back the creature that it exiled at some point is a huge deal. Whereas, if you give the opponent's the owner just a token, just a vanilla token, that is not a big deal. We've seen cards like Pongify, Beast Within, Generous Gift, where like you have super efficient, flexible removal. And the downside is you give that owner a token, and that token just does nothing. It's like, it could hurt a little bit. It's a chump blocker maybe, but it's such a minimal downside in a multiplayer format like Commander. So the fact that you're not giving back the creature and instead giving a token is such a huge upgrade. It's hard to understate. And also, compared to Skyclave compared to like Banisher Priest or Fiend Hunter or the like, those cards can only exile creatures. And Skyclave Apparition, while it's restricted to mana cost 4 or less, it can hit any non-land permanent, which is insane. And non-land non-token permanent, which is like an insane upgrade. It's like up to like Beast Within Generous Gift style upgrade. It's an absolutely insane card.
Yeah, this card is so good, and I feel like maybe people might even underestimate its power a little bit because of that 4 CMC or less restriction. I think a lot of times people think Commander is like filled with all these really expensive cards, and while it is true that more expensive cards do see play in Commander, if you look at a lot of the most played cards that every deck are playing, most of them are under 4 converted mana costs. You got a ton of mana rocks, you have powerful enchantments like Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Studies, you have lots of like efficient creatures, Mana Dorks and Eternal Witnesses. So I feel like this hits on an actually surprisingly large amount of stuff that you care about, and not giving it back is so massive in Commander, because in Commander everyone's playing Wrath, so you can't really count on a creature like this to stick around. It's only a 2/2, it dies to all removal, it dies to all the Wraths, but the fact that you can play this for 3 mana, get rid of a Rhystic Study, a Smothering Tithe, a powerful ramping mana rock like Soul Ring or something, and then when it dies, which it inevitably will die, your opponent's just getting a random, not very threatening in a 40 life format token, makes this card really, really good. Obviously, like, it's a core and a spirit, so there might be some like fringe tribal synergies, but I think you can just play this in a lot of white decks. Also, really, really sweet in Blink style decks. It goes even up more in value if you're Bragoing or doing anything like that, because you're only giving back a token. Like, you can't Blink Deputy Detentions and Banisher Priests because you're just giving back the first, like, I guess you can kind of do it and try to like hit a bad target early in the game and then reset it to get something later in the game. But this becomes an absurd Blink target because your opponent's just continually getting back these tokens that you don't care about, and then you're just sniping all of their real things that you do care about and they do care about, which makes it even more powerful compared to past versions. So I feel like this is easy staple in Blink decks, and something that I will probably consider running in just like a lot of white decks. I think it's that good as a removal spell. Yeah,
I think it checks all the boxes. It's really good in just about any white deck. It gets better if you're running like cards that care about 2 power, like Dustodon or Mentor of the Meek. It gets better because it's 3 CMC, so it's fetchable with Sun Titan. And then if you're in a Blink deck, it's just absolutely absurd. So Brago, Chulane, Teller of Tales, all those sort of decks is just like a new staple.
Let's move on to number 6 on our list. And we have an old friend, actually our exclusive Goldfish spoiler for Zendikar Rising, Lichiform Edge. And so we already went pretty in depth with this one during our spoiler video, which we'll pop up a card or something, put a link in the description if you want to see a really in-depth discussion of what Lichiform Edge can do. But Tomer, what's a quick version of this new potential Commander staple?
So quick version of this is basically it's like a Swiss Army knife that is at least 3 cards merged together: Rings of Brighthearth, Strionic Resonator, and Mirari. And then plus a bonus brand new ability that we've never seen before, copy target permanent spell you control. Most decks, it's not as good as those 3 cards at its that singular purpose, but the real beauty of this card is its flexibility, that it could do all of these things at all times. And what's so great about the Lichiform engine is you're going to be running this card in a deck that cares about one specific thing it does, like copying target instant or sorcery, or if you're in a deck that like runs Rings of Brighthearth, for example, you'll run this as a second Rings of Brighthearth or a second Strionic Resonator because it does that same effect really well. But the beauty of it is that even in the decks that only that is running it for only one of its abilities, you're still going to get value out of the other abilities, because just because, for example, I'm in a Brago deck that really wants a Strionic Resonator effect, I'm running Engine for its ability to copy triggered abilities, I'm still going to have situations where I want to copy an activate ability. Maybe I'm cracking a fetch land and I have, Engine on the battlefield and 2 extra mana. Now I can get 2 lands when I crack the fetch land. Or, it's later on in the game and I cast a big old spell like Diluvian Primordial, and I have 4 extra mana. Why don't I make a copy of Diluvian Primordial and I have 2 Diluvian Primordials? I'm still running the cards primarily for the triggered ability, the Strionic Resonator effect, but I get all this other value as well. And that's what makes Lichiform Engine so great.
Yeah, that flexibility, I think, is very, very huge. It's really hard for this card to ever be bad. I think you do mostly play it in decks where you actively want one of its abilities. Maybe you're built around the activated triggered abilities. Maybe you're a spell slinger, spell copying deck, and you really want the 3 mana copying instant or sorcery. Maybe you're some sort of permanent shenanigan creature copying deck and you want the last ability. But it's the flexibility that makes this card so good. It's really, really hard for it to ever be bad. You mentioned fetch lands. Even that's really powerful. You turn every fetch land into essentially like a rampant growth for 2 mana, which that by itself is really strong. And then things get really nutty once you start like Yarocking, doubling up triggers, getting multiple smothering ties on the battlefield, like copying your kicked right of replication, like it's absolutely absurd. So it's really hard for it to ever be bad. I don't know. Do you think you can play this in just any deck, Tomer? I think, personally, I think you can play it in any deck, and it'll probably be okay, but I'm leaning towards, personally, playing it in decks that really want one of the abilities, and then just getting extra value out of its flexibility.
I totally agree with you. I was noticing, like, a lot of the responses, at least online to this card, was like, oh, this card's overpowered, it's a new staple in all decks, like, why wouldn't you run it? And I think that's kind of, like, overrating it a little bit. Like, I think the card is going to be fantastic in any deck that really cares about one of its abilities. But if you jam it into any deck, yeah, you'll get some value out of it because it's hard not to get value out of it. But is it worth a slot? I don't know. I don't think so. I think you'll be happy with it in any deck. But you won't be like, super excited when it shows up or anything. And it's not going to like carry the game for you consistently. So I would put it mostly in decks that actually care about one of its abilities and builds around that. And then just get incidental value out of the rest.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. And it is worth mentioning, like, it is pretty expensive to get going. That's one thing I've noticed, like, playing it I haven't played it too much in Commander yet, but playing in other formats, when you look at it, you're like, oh, it's going to be really sweet to, like, copy my Cloudblazer or Muldrifter or whatever. But then you got to consider, like, you got to cast this for 4 mana, and it does nothing for the first turn. Then you have to cast, like, a 5 mana spell. Then you have to have 4 extra mana to activate it. That mana cost does add up. I don't think that is a reason the card is bad or anything. I think it's still really good, but it is worth keeping in mind that this is really, for the most part, kind of like a mid to late game value engine card, or potential like combo piece depending on your deck, rather than something that's going to give you any immediate value in the early game. So it is a little slow to really get going, but once it gets going, then it offers an insane amount of value turn after turn. And once you start copying like your ramp spells, then you get more lands, which you kind of like snowball into having the mana to copy your permanent spells. But I think it is worth keeping in mind that it does take a while for its power to really be unlocked.
Yeah, it's a big mana investment, but it is worth it once you do have that mana. Let's
move on to number 5 on our list. We're entering the world of angels and life gain shenanigans, I guess. Angel of Destiny, one of the more unique cards from Zendikar Rising, can potentially one-shot kill anyone from any life total, but you gotta get up to 55 life and actually attack with the Angel of Destiny. So Tomer, what do you think about this one? Is this just a life gain deck staple, or does it have more flexibility and value outside of like dedicated hardcore life gain decks?
So it's going to be most consistent in life gain, like dedicated life gain decks, like you said. But I think this card might be just decent enough to be jammed into a whole bunch of different white decks. So for example, it's a cleric, so it's gonna fit in cleric tribal decks, which I guess is not fair because cleric tribal is usually life gain decks anyway. So so it's good in life gain decks. It's good in cleric tribal because those are life gain decks as well. It's obviously an angel, so it's one of the best angels in angel tribal, which is also usually a life gain deck. So so those are all life gain decks, but is it good in non-dedicated life gain decks? And I think the answer is sometimes. So the reason why I like it in a lot of different white decks is a lot of like the good white cards are just like randomly just gain you life. Like one card that I almost always jam into my white decks these days is Serra Ascendant. Not because I'm a life gain deck, just because it's a 1/1 like 6/6 flyer with lifelink. Or sorry, it's a 1 mana 6/6 flyer with lifelink in Commander, which is just, it's busted. It's a very silly powerful card. And if you have like that in your deck and you have like a little 1 mana utility creature package with like Ranger of Eos and similar effects, getting up to 55 life in just like a random white deck is actually really good or really easy. And then there's additional synergies that the card has. It's really good. The 2 power is actually a benefit rather than a drawback, because it works really well with cards like Dustodon and Mentor of the Meek. And also it holds equipments really well, which is also a primary archetype in white. So if you have any equipment that has a powerful combat trigger, because it has double strike, you get 2 of those combat triggers. So if you equip like Sword of Light and Shadow onto it, now you're going to be gaining 6 life and also returning 2 creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. And speaking of equipments, it's also incredibly powerful with Helm of the Host. So now, not only do you kill 1 person, you're actually killing 2 people per combat step. And obviously, if you add red to the mix, you get extra combat steps. You can kill multiple opponents pretty easily with multiple attack triggers. So that's really good. I think this card is one of the best white cards we've gotten in a long time.
Yeah, I think this card's really good too. I think the Myriad equipment also pretty scary on this card since it's not legendary. Like split it up and hit everyone could be pretty powerful.
And that one doesn't work.
It doesn't work? Why doesn't it work?
So a lot of people get this wrong, and I got this wrong myself too. When I wrote the article, people pointed it out. The Blade of Cells does not work with Angel of Destiny, so this is actually a good PSA on it. The Angel of Destiny, it's only each player attacked this turn loses the game, and the problem is that the Blade of Cells tokens enter the battlefield already attacking. So you miss that attack trigger. So that invalidates it. The second thing that I actually didn't check with the editor or anything, but maybe this also invalidates it, is that the tokens leave at the end of combat. So not going to be around at end step. But I'm not sure if that actually invalidates it, but the attacking part definitely invalidates it.
Okay, so ignore that. Okay, let me talk about something that I'm pretty sure does work that I like about Angel of Destiny, which is, even though the exciting part of the card is obviously the ability to one-shot kill someone after you attack them with it, it does kind of do something right away with that first ability, where whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, they each gain life. So you can play this, even if it doesn't have haste or anything, get in a big attack, gain a big amount of life, and in a life gain deck, that's kind of what you want. You're triggering your Heliod's. That's also how life gain decks and some white decks can generate card advantage with cards like Well of the Lost Dreams, being able to draw you cards, which is obviously very hard to do in white decks a lot of the time. So I like that it can do something immediately, and it's really not that hard in a deck that is sort of interested in gaining life, and potentially with Angel of Destiny, even a deck that's not a dedicated life gain deck, just a white creature deck that can go wide and get in a big attack to get up to 55 life. Plus it helps turn on all your other life gain stuff, your Felidare Sovereigns, your Johnny Strength of the Pride, to get up enough life to have the exile all your opponent's stuff mode. So I think this card's really good. I think I would consider playing this outside of life gain decks, but I think it is most obviously just like an easy staple in any white or white X deck that is caring about life gain.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can just play Angel of Destiny and get to 55 life pretty easily just by its own combat trigger. So, especially if you give it like haste and then you attack with a bunch of creatures, deal damage, and you're just gonna get like, this gives you 4 life, and then you're just, you gain a bunch of life some other ways too, and then boom, Angel of Destiny just wins you. It kills people. And even if it doesn't, it just helps light main decks.
Let's move on to number 4 on our list, and we have a group of card here. So we are talking about Rogues. Rogues is a tribe that I feel like hasn't really been super popular in Commander up until Zendikar Rising. Like, one thing I've realized from the release of Zendikar Rising is people really love Rogues, but I can't really think of too many times, or even off the top of my head, any times, that I've played against a straight up Rogue tribal deck in Commander. But now, thanks to Zendikar Rising and the Commander deck that comes with it, we get 2 new really sweet Rogue Legends that people are going to be building around. We get new Pseudo Lords. We get Thieving Skydiver. Tomer, how good are Rogues going to be in Commander post Zendikar Rising?
I think they're going to be legit. Like you said, we haven't really seen Rogue Tribal as a supported archetype in Commander up until this point. We've seen inklings of Rogue support in I think the last time was Lorwyn Shadowmoor, where you had a bunch of, you had a bunch of Prowl cards, and those cards are sweet, or at least 2 of them are sweet. But after that, there just hasn't been Rogue Tribal support. And now we got Anawan, the Ruined Thief, which is an amazing Rogue Tribal commander, does everything you want. And also, I think this set has given Rogues an identity. We've had a couple cards previously that gave that identity, but I guess maybe the past 2 years, I would say, Rogue Tribal has now gotten an identity where it's all about attacking, milling your opponents to put stuff in the graveyard, not to mill them out, but just to fill their graveyard with mill effects, and then stealing stuff from their graveyard. That is a primary thing, and they usually focus on stealing creatures. And you can kind of see that with these tribal cards. So Anawan does that thing. He buffs rogues. He mills. And he draws you some cards. So it rewards you for attacking, and it mills, and then he draws you some cards. And then Zerath's kind of the flip side of that. So now you attack with Zerath, you deal combat damage, and you steal something that you've milled with Zerath. So that's the very powerful payoff. And then Soaring Thought Thief, again, same thing. You attack with your rogues, and you mill your opponent to set up for that death effect afterwards. So those cards, it's a pretty straightforward tribe where it's just all about attacking, milling your opponents, and then stealing stuff that you've milled. And it's very effective, and it's very appealing. This is a really cool tribe for what it does. I also threw in Thieving Skydiver, which is one of the best rogues. It's not even necessarily limited to just rogue tribal decks, though. The effect is really, really powerful. If you just kick it for 1, basically, you can start stealing Soul Rings or Mana Crypts or whatever. So, and everybody's running Soul Rings. So, odds are you're going to steal something good with Thieving Skydiver at all times. And its cost for stealing artifacts is actually very efficient, which makes it incredibly appealing in a whole bunch of decks, even outside of Rogue Tribal, and probably best in decks that can bounce it back to your hand. So ninjutsu decks, for example, that can return it back to your hand so you can steal more things. That's going to be very powerful. But yeah, the Rogue Tribal deck is very legit now.
I would not be surprised to see that Rogue Tribal might be the single most popular Zendikar Rising commander deck. I think people are really hyped for this. I expect this to be a deck that lots of people are building. And combining Zendikar Rising with the old stuff from Lorwyn Morningtide, there actually is enough to make a really sweet deck. I almost feel like Rogues are kind of similar to ninjas, except now, thanks to this Zendikar Rising set with a ton of new rogues, I feel like has a lot more support than ninjas. There's just not that many ninjas in existence, but you kind of have the same, attacking, getting payoffs for attacking. Zerasan, almost actually has ninjutsu for the most part, or a slightly different version of ninjutsu. So I feel like this is going to be a pretty powerful and popular tribe. There's some really good cards cards from back during the Lorwyn Morningtide. You got lords, like Una's Blackguard is a really sweet, like, pseudo-lord for rogues. You have Steam Trick or Bandit, another pseudo-lord. So I feel like it's going to be really popular, really good. As far as Thieving Skydiver, I think this might be, like, almost my number one card from the set, outside of Rogues. Like, you'll play it in Rogues because it is Rogues, but I feel like Thieving Skydiver is a new staple in Commander. I'm planning on playing it in essentially every blue deck. I feel like there's so many mana rocks, and then that's even discounting the upside of hitting a bigger, like, mana doubler or some more powerful artifact later in the game. But it's really hard for me to imagine this ever being bad. I feel like on, like, turn 3 to turn 4, you can think of this as a ramp spell, essentially, that leaves behind a body, and then you're buying in this upside where you're able to bounce it back to your hand, you're able to draw it in the late game, steal something even more powerful. So I kind of feel like Thieving Skydiver is just one of the, like, singular best Commander cards from this entire set, and should see play in a lot of blue decks. Probably also going to be a good C EDH card on that level, where people are playing even more busted, powerful mana rocks and really value efficiency. So I think that card is a really good standalone card, even discounting the Rogue Tribe.
I hate Thieving Skydiver so much.
Do you? Why?
I hate it so much.
Wait, okay, quick question. Thieving Skydiver or Hedron Archive?
I think Thieving Skydiver is my least favorite card. It is my least favorite card in the set. And it's not because it's like the card itself is bad. It's because you will be playing it, and Krim will be playing it, and Richard will be playing it, and you just want to steal my Cauldra, all right?
It does seem like the Soul Crusher for Cauldra.
Man. Every single time you guys play blue now.
There's good news though, Tomer, because as we get a little bit further along our list, you do get some, like, Cauldra support too, a new Cauldra commander. So let's keep moving on and get to the good news for Cauldra.
30 minutes, or it's free.
Next on our list, we have another group of cards, kicker stuff. We actually have a really sweet kicker commander now in Verazal, which, yes, we have Halar, but Halar is like a really aggressive kicker commander. The way I want to play kicker is exactly how Verazal has you play kicker, which is just kind of like kicking card draw spells, copying your card draw spells, getting them back from your graveyard with Marissa Spoutling, digging for them with Korahom Chronicler. Like, that's exactly how I want to play kicker, and I feel like Verazal is, like, perfect for that. It's even a little bit designed for Commander with how it's worded, so you get the counters on it from paying the Commander tax if it happens to die. So what do you think about these kicker cards, Tomer?
I think you nailed it. Like, Halar the Fire Fletcher is actually a really powerful kicker deck, or kicker commander, but it's a very aggressive deck, right? It's, like, very explosive and tries to kill your opponents pretty quickly, right? Once it gets going. Verazal, on the other hand, is, like, the exact opposite, where you play it and you dirtle and you generate lots and lots of value, and your opponents basically die of old age as you continue to play solitaire with yourself, which, I mean, appeals to a different subset of people. And you know what? I'm very excited for it too. I want to dirtle like that as well. And I think with Zendikar Rising especially, there's a lot of really, really good kicker cards that, you know, aren't the very best at what they're trying to do. So they're actually less desirable for the majority of players. But if you have a kicker commander like Verazal, which really amps up their power level, they become legitimately really good cards. So we have a bunch of really, like, at this point, especially in Simic colors, we have a lot of really good kicker cards to fill out a deck. And what really excites me about Verazal in particular is that the kicker deck, I think, is going to be incredibly budget friendly. You can make a really powerful deck that is kicker tribal under Verazal, like, legit, really, really strong, but is going to be very budget friendly because a lot of the cards are not desirable in other formats, in other decks. So I can imagine playing, like, a really strong Verazal deck that's like $25 US and be really happy with my card choices, not feel like I'm really missing out on a lot of cards. And that's a really good feeling. Like, this is the commander out of all the commanders in the set. This is my second favorite of the entire set, just because I know I can make a super budget-friendly deck that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, this is my favorite commander from the set, and I can't wait to actually play it. Let's move on. Number 2 on our list, we have a couple of Landfall cards. Omnath, Locust of Creation, and Land Harmonicon, Ancient Green Warden, Tomer. What are we doing with these Landfall legends / payoffs in Commander?
Okay, so it's no secret the Zendikar Rising has a lot of goodies for the Landfall deck and the Lands Matter deck. You know, the Modal Lands and just like everything about the set. But these two kind of struck me as like the most absurd of the absurd. So we got Omnath. We've had 3 previous iterations of Omnath where Omnath starts green and slowly adds more and more colors as the years go by. This one is probably my pick for the best Landfall commander out there. It has some incredibly relevant effects. First of all, like you enter the battlefield, you draw a card. That's really cute. Thank you, Words of the Coast, for throwing that in. The first landfall trigger is whatever, you ignore it. The second one though, it generates a ton of mana. And then the third time, it's like a mini board wipe. It's going to kill your opposing planeswalkers, kill most of the small creatures. There's a lot to work here. This is a lot of value for just 4 mana. Obviously,
I should say it doesn't actually hit opposing creatures, only opponents and their planeswalkers. So just so that part is clear.
Right. That is a good clarification. Not as good as I thought, but it does deal 4 damage to each opponent, which is very nice. And it does make Super Friend decks, cry. So I think the strongest ability here is actually its ramp ability. And just keep in mind, 2 landfall triggers, all you need to do is basically play and crack a fetch land, and boom, your fetch land that you've played generated 4 extra mana, which is kind of insane. So the card has a very strong baseline, especially for just 4 mana. It gets a lot better if you're running blink effects, because not only if you blink Omnath, not only do you get to draw another card, but it actually resets all of its landfall abilities because it's a new Omnath on the battlefield. So you get to gain 4 more life and then generate 4 more mana, and then eventually burn opposing planeswalkers and opponents. So you can actually generate multiple extra mana that way. There might be some infinite combos there, but the true power behind Omnath Locust of Creation and what makes it so appealing to people is that it has 4 colors worth of landfall cards, or landfall cards to choose from. So now you could run like your Tech Yovas beside Knight of the Reliquary and Mina and Den Wildborn, like all these like landfall Lands of Matter staples can all be fit under one roof. It doesn't have black yet. It will soon.
Next set.
Next set, yeah, basically. But you can run like the vast majority of them all in the same deck, so that makes it incredibly appealing.
Yeah, I think Omnath is just really good. If you want to go 4 colors with your landfall deck, it is the way to go. It's a very strong card, just in an absolute sense. It's hard for it to be bad with the enter the battlefield, draw a card, so it's just really good. I think for me, though, I'm even more excited about Ancient Green Warden. I love Panharmonicon effects. I also love Crucible of World land from your graveyard effects. I will say, this is a Panharmonicon that's pretty difficult to abuse. There's not a ton of lands with enter the battlefield triggers that are relevant, and outside of the actual keyword landfall, there's not a whole lot of cards that care about lands entering the battlefield. It's mostly landfall stuff. However, with landfall in specific, this card gets really crazy. We've already seen it just wrecking standard in conjunction with kind of like scape shift style effects in cards like Lotus Cobra, where you can make absurd amount of mana. We have stuff like Scoot Swarm, which is a very powerful landfall creature that copies stuff. We have all the old landfall stuff, Adamation Angels and so forth. So I feel like this, in a landfall deck, this is going to be one of the best cards in your deck in an auto include. It also has a pretty reasonable body, and I like the Crucible of Worlds effect as well. I think there are decks that are really going to want the playing lands from your graveyard effect, self-mill style decks, where you can kind of mill yourself over and still make your land drops. It works well with extra land drop effects, if you have Azusa's and so forth in your deck, to do some even bigger shenanigans. So I think that Ancient Green Warden is very good in the Omnath deck, in any Landfall deck, and offers some potential in other archetypes as well.
I think this card is just like insane in any lands deck, and particularly insane in Landfall decks. Just like, it's BFF, so it's just like a fetch land, right? Like, you have a Wooded Foothills in your graveyard, you get to play it from your graveyard and then immediately crack it, and the act of putting a Wooded Foothills onto the battlefield is 2 Landfall triggers, and then you just crack it, and then if you have other ways to cast additional lands each turn, like Azusa, you just, play the same Wooded Foothills over and over again, and you just like have insane ramp, insane landfall triggers, insane everything. It's 6 mana, so it takes a while to get there. Kind of, maybe, theoretically, but this is going to be in a land deck, so 6 mana is actually nothing, and it's going to be insane in all those types of decks. I will say also on Omnath, though, the thing I actually like about Omnath, other than it's an absurdly strong card, I think it is the strongest Landfall commander out there, but I do like that it doesn't invalidate the older Omnaths. And what I mean by this is I actually think Omnath Locus of Rage, you can have an argument that maybe that is even stronger than Omnath Locus in Creation, just because like if Omnath actually enters the battlefield and like gets a bunch of landfall triggers, your opponents are just dead, right? Like you just make an army of elementals and you kill everybody with it, or if you get wiped, then everybody still dies. And Omnath Locus of Mana, mono green Omnath, is still incredibly powerful as well in its own right. So I actually like this design. The main strength is that you can play all 4 colors, but and the card itself is actually very, very powerful, but it's not to the point that it overshadows everything else that came before, which, good job, Wizards.
Yeah, and it mostly cares about different things. I guess Omnath Locust of Rage is also landfall-y, but as you mentioned, it's kind of different. Omnath from Core Set 2020 is more of like an elemental tribal style commander for the most part, and then mono green Omnath doesn't really care about landfall in specific at all. So I do feel like they did a really good job of keeping all the Omnaths relevant. Plus, now you can play like Omnath Tribal if you want to. And if you jam them all together in your Omnath Locust of Creation deck, because it gives you all of the colors you need, they're all going to be really good. Like Omnath Locust of Rage cares about a lot of the same things. Mono green Omnath can ramp you. All your Omnaths are elementals. You probably want like Risen Reefs and stuff because it works well with landfall triggers. So your Core Set 2020 Omnath will still be good. So I like that they are all individual, but they also can all work together and make a cool like Omnath Tribal deck.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm hyped for this one.
Last on our list, number 1. And I should say this is a list that was mostly assembled by Tomer, so it's maybe not a surprise that our Boros Cauldron commander, Kiri Fearless Voyager, number 1 on the list. So I gotta say, Tomer, and then I'll kick it to you and let you discuss this. I gotta say, I was surprised when I saw Kiri, obviously a really good equipment commander. I was surprised when I looked for other Boros equipment commanders and found that the cupboard was actually pretty bare. Like, I associate Boros pretty strongly with equipment in Commander, but there's not a lot of like really good just Boros equipment commanders. Is Akiri the new best Boros equipment commander in the format?
Absolutely. It's like also the official, like the only one that actually cares about equipments in general. We've seen other Boros commanders that kind of can work as a equipment commander. For example, the older Akiri Lineslinger, gets stronger, is like a 2-mana Akiri, and gets a higher power level as you have more and more artifacts on the battlefield. Not equipments, artifacts. But the idea would be this is a cheap partner that you can easily put onto the battlefield, is going to hit really, really hard. It holds equipments really, really well. And then also Aurelia the War Leader is another good example where she lets you have an extra combat step every single turn, which in itself doesn't help equipments, but does kind of indirectly help them because a lot of the best equipments have powerful combat triggers, like all of the sword cycles. So you get another combat step equals more combat triggers. So that's kind of good. Akiri Fearless Voyager, though, is the first and only Boros commander that actually cares about equipments specifically. And what she does is incredibly powerful. And I'm kind of shocked that people are sleeping on Akiri and saying that she's not that great because she's insane. So what's great about her is, number one, whenever you attack a player with one or more equipped creatures, you draw a card. Drawing cards is the best thing ever. So you can be drawing up to 3 cards per attack step or per attack phase with Akiri. If you're playing a 4-player free-for-all game and you have 3 opponents and you attack each one. So that's insane. That's a really good, efficient card draw for a 3-mana card. And then the other insane thing that I really, really like is that you can pay just 1 white mana to unattach an equipment from a creature you control. And if you do, you tap that creature and it gains indestructible until end of turn. It's kind of like Akiri's sending out her like hook rope thingies to save a creature from falling. That's how I envision it. It's like she's kind of saving you with her equipments, which is kind of cool, but it's highly relevant ability. Like, the worst thing is, if you have an equipment deck, you need to have your creatures alive for them to be equipped so you can actually get your value out of your equipments. So board wipes and stuff can really set it back. And this is a super efficient way to make sure that your creatures aren't dying to at least the more generic sorts of removal spells. Like, it doesn't protect you against exile or sacrifice, but they will protect you from like Wrath of Gods and similar effects. So the fact that both of them are on the same creature for 3 mana is absolutely absurd.
Yeah, it is just a super powerful card in an equipment deck. If you want to assemble Kaldra in Boros, this is probably the best way to do it. I also like, as you mentioned, the card advantage. The creature types are also relevant. We have, from original Zendikar, core tend to care about equipment. So if you want to build like core tribal, you probably want to be equipment anyway. This gives you a really good option for that, and we have a strong warrior equipment theme from Zendikar Rising itself with like new Nahiri, a bunch of other warriors that care about equipment. You can get around the unattaching issue of having to spend a bunch of mana to reattach it with some other cards that you probably are going to want in your deck, like Pure Steel Paladin style effects to let you re-equip for free. It works really well with Pure Steels and Srobs for even more card advantage. You get to draw your cards as you're playing your equipments, and then draw more cards as you're attacking with your equipped creatures, which you could do because you could use your Akiri to make your stuff indestructible if you need to, so you can get in for that card draw, because you don't have to actually hit your opponent necessarily. It just says attack, so you don't even have to like connect, so you can potentially just attack into blockers, use Akiri to protect your team, be drawing those cards every turn and snowball it from there. This card it's really, really good. It's just a very strong equipment commander. It's efficient. It does everything you want. It even draws cards. Yeah, this card is super, super fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's everything I've ever wanted for an equipment deck. Like, I've always really liked my mono white equipment decks because white is a primary color for equipments. Red, not so much, but it is like a secondary color. But I've always really wanted to put Sunforger in my equipment decks. Akiri lets me do that. And Akiri just works really well with certain red things like extra combat steps like Aurelia, for example. And you basically, instead of just drawing 3 cards per turn, you're now drawing 6 cards per turn. And just like that beautiful resiliency against removal, it's just beautiful. It's a great card. Love it. Going to play it a ton. And I'm going to definitely build a paper version of Akiri as quickly as possible.
On that note, I think that brings us to the end of our top 10 Zendikar Rising cards for Commander. Tomer, any final thoughts on the way out the door today?
Did we nail the time, Seth? Did we get it?
I think basically we kept it under 1.5 hours. It's close enough.
I think the editor in post can keep it under 30 minutes, right?
Oh, easily. He'll have it down to like 15, I'm sure. No problem.
Yeah, easy. Some time for our sponsors afterwards.
Well, Tomer, thanks for hanging out and doing it. It's always a blast to do these top 10 videos.
Absolutely, Seth. My pleasure.
And thanks everyone for watching. So you've kind of seen our top 10 Commander cards. Let us know in the comments what Commander cards from Zendikar Rising you're most excited for to play in the format. As Tomer mentioned, there's a ton from this set. Check out his review articles. There's way more that we could ever cover in a top 10 video. Even a top 10 video that's an hour and 15 minutes long. There's just too much goodness in the set. So let us know what you like. Check out the top 10 videos. We will be back in Not too long, honestly, because Commander Legends is right around the corner and we'll have more new Commander cards to talk about that. So until then, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, help us out by clicking the like button down below. And to keep up with the latest and greatest, make sure to click the subscribe button. And if you want to watch similar videos, click on the links appearing on screen right now.